Welcome to the Election University podcast, a weekly show where we hear from industry experts who share tips and tricks for winning campaigns. Whether you're running for office now, thinking about it for the future, or just want to know more about campaigns and elections, Election University is for you. With Election University, click, learn, win. And now your host, Jason Bennett and Rainey Cohen.
Hello.
Hi.
How are you doing, Rainey?
Oh, I'm all right. I have a bit of a sore throat today, so I apologize to our listeners if I get scratchy at some point, but I'm here. I'm ready.
I'm ready to take on the burden of filling in.
In case you need to cover for me?
Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks. Appreciate you.
Yeah, appreciate you. And welcome to our listeners to another episode of the Election University podcast. Really pumped for today's episode.
Super pumped.
Super pumped. And we're going to be talking today with Eric Liu, who is a former speechwriter for President Bill Clinton. Mm-hmm. We are listening to our listeners.
It goes both ways.
It goes both ways. We are listening to our listeners who provide us feedback. And one of our outstanding fans out there, Nicole, shout out to Nicole.
Hey, Nicole.
Gave us some feedback that she would really appreciate hearing an episode about speech writing and how you do a stump speech. So that's what today's episode is completely devoted to. And we don't just sort of listen and get any run-of-the-mill speechwriter. We go right to the top.
Right. Only former presidential speechwriters, please. Because if you're going to write a stump speech, that's the guy that you want to be able to teach you.
Right. And you know, there are very few speechwriters who I think get as many accolades and are as active as Eric Liu is. So, in addition to being a former speechwriter and policy advisor for President Bill Clinton, he has written 3 books that I'm aware of right now. 1, 2, 3, 4 books.
Right.
Excuse me. He's written 4 books. You're More Powerful Than You Think, which is a citizen's guide to making change happen, which is his new book that is out right now. The Gardens of Democracy, The Accidental Asian. Actually, there's more than this.
There's a fifth. There's more.
There's definitely more than
True
this.
Patriot. Gardens of Democracy and True Patriot, he wrote alongside businessman Nick Hanauer.
Right.
And those are kind of often given away or sold as a package. I don't know. Amazing author. Let's just say that.
Yep.
He's been writing for decades, not only books, but speeches. He is also the founder and CEO of Citizen University, which is it's a way for citizens to be engaged in the democratic process beyond just voting.
Right.
Like how you can show up as a good neighbor, how you can show up as a good citizen, how you can foster conversations with people who you don't necessarily agree with. And might I say, Eric Liu is one of the most positive, optimistic people who I have ever met. And anytime you talk to him, he just has all the ideas on how to spin things to the bright side. And here's their solution. Don't spend any time wallowing in, the sadness or the problem. Here's the solution. And here's how you do the work to do it.
Right. And not only is Eric writing books and changing lives, but he also is on TV. He does Citizen University TV as well. And he's a frequent commenter on CNN, and he's been in race documentaries on PBS. Mm-hmm. He is everywhere. Where this guy gets his energy from, I do not know, but we need to bottle it up and take about 6 gallons down here at Election University podcast.
Well, and another thing he does here in the Seattle area, and maybe he's expanded it beyond this, is Civic Saturdays, which I have heard him describe as church for political nerds. So it's
I thought that was the bar.
Well, maybe that's afterwards. I don't know. Because the whole point is gathering with like-minded people to discuss things that are important to you and to have community and pump each other up. So
right. That's fantastic. So we're really excited to talk with Eric today. Let's stop this jibber jabber and get right to the interview. Eric, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's awesome to be with you.
Before we get started, we read a little bit of your bio in the introduction, but we'd love to know more about the speechwriting work that you did and specifically the work that you did in the White House.
Sure. Well, I worked two different stints for President Clinton. During the first part of his first term, I was a speechwriter for him, doing mainly foreign affairs, national security type speeches, and probably the most memorable and significant of those was the set of speeches that I wrote for him for the 50th anniversary of D-Day, of the Allied invasion of Normandy. That was in June of 1994. And that was a pretty, just unforgettable experience to be part of that work with, being a Gen X at the time kid, writing for the country's first baby boom president as he was trying to honor the GI generation in perhaps its kind of signal moment of, kind of world-changing heroism. That was pretty awesome. But I did all kinds of speeches ranging from big show pieces like that to just everyday, so-and-so prime minister is in town. You got to have a short toast or welcoming remark, what have you. And then later on, toward the end of the Clinton administration, I'd left. I'd gone to law school and started writing books, but I came back for the end, for the final year plus. And that time I was the president's deputy domestic policy advisor. And so it was a very different experience. It was policy instead of speech writing. It was much more senior. It was domestic instead of foreign policy. But of course, it was also the end rather than the beginning. And so just really interesting bookends of experience there.
You mentioned that you left to go write books. In the intro, Jason and I didn't have an accurate count of how many books have you written?
I have written 7 books now.
All right,
wow.
We almost got there.
Yeah, we said 5. We were off by 2. Lucky number 7.
So
2 of the anyway, and some of them are about citizenship and American kind of politics and democracy. Some of them are about race and American identity. And some of them are more about mentorship and mindset. So,
very cool.
Yeah, that's great. So back to speech writing, which is obviously the topic of the podcast. Do you think that speech writing has changed since your time in the White House? And if so, how?
The short answer is yes, only because, the environment in which speeches are heard has changed so much. Even at the time that I was writing for President Clinton in the mid-90s, of course, we were well steeped in a television soundbite culture. And so even if you were writing long speeches that were filled with stuff that would matter to the wonks and to the very, insider audience, you were always mindful as a speechwriter of writing, certain soundbites that you knew would get picked up by TV or by national media. But that, I think, has accelerated. And today, with people's Twitter length attention spans, I think the tail's wagging the dog. The sound bites driving the speech more than ever. I think a second thing that has changed, of course, is that it's pretty hard to hold people's attention for very long, and so speeches have gotten shorter, have gotten punchier, and there's a little, with the exception of big moments like a State of the Union or something like that, there's a little less theatricality to it, and a little bit more just off-the-cuffness. And that's partly the Trump effect, but it's also, quite frankly, the Sanders effect. People who are blowing apart old notions of what a political orator is supposed to sound like, look like, act like, and perform like. And so there is this much wider range of styles that are now, quote, okay in speech giving and speech writing.
We both know, Rainey and I both know you to be a pretty optimistic person in politics, and you've worked in politics a long time. How do you maintain your optimism and hope, particularly in a time like right now? Well,
I guess the short answer is by not focusing too much on national politics. And I don't mean that to be glib. I mean, of course, there are certain things that you cannot avoid focusing on, or certain fires that we, have to get the bucket brigade to put out that are coming out of D.C. and particularly out of this administration. But the fact is that when you go outside of the Beltway and you are just in the kinds of places where so many of your listeners are from, locally rooted, worrying about local and state elections, worrying about county council, worrying about city council and state legislatures and things like that, at the ground level in this country right now, I actually think we're in the midst of a great civic awakening and a great renewal. And my work at Citizen University brings me all over the United States, to small towns and big ones, and in red places and blue places. And I guess I have a lot of hope because everywhere I go, I see people who are just fixing stuff, who are figuring out creative new ways to engage people, who are solving problems and aren't just caught up in the reality TV show of national politics.
Yeah, and I think that we're seeing that too. And part of, this podcast being a resource for down ballot candidates are those regular folks who are doing the community organizing, who are engaging with their neighbors, and now they want to run for office. And so we have, a lot of people who aren't necessarily political people, but now they want to run for office. And so picking apart the basics of putting together a good stump speech is exactly what we want to do. So can we talk about what are the elements of a good speech?
Well, I think there's three elements or dimensions to pay attention to in any speech. It doesn't even have to be a stump speech, but any speaking that you're going to do. One is the strategy. That's the first dimension. The second is the architecture, the structure. And then the third dimension is kind of the music of it, how it sounds and how it makes you feel. So let me just say a quick word about each of these. On strategy, it sounds so obvious, but when you go to any, and both of you have been to, countless arenas where you hear candidates giving speeches, it's sort of stunning how few candidates actually walk into the arena with a pretty clear, sharp sense of their strategy for what they're trying to achieve with that talk. And I think as a candidate, if you can think crisply about what's my objective, and if you can really hone that objective down to the sharpest, fiercest, clearest statement, down to like a half sentence. My objective in this speech is to fill in the blank, and it should be verb and a couple of other words after that. Change minds about gun safety, or get people to support this tax, or believe that it's time for change in how we're represented in the state legislature. Sharpen that objective down as crisply as you can, because I think one of the big problems that people have in making stump speeches is they often have a bucket of objectives and a bunch of different goals at once, and and your speeches get rambly and all over the place when you're trying to go after multiple objectives at once. I mean, so that's one is being super focused on strategy and your objectives, the second dimension of structure or architecture, I think is really simple and important too. I often, I've taught this class at the University of Washington for years called How to Read, Write, and Speak, about how to make arguments in public, basically. And when we get to the part that's about speaking, and basic public speaking for persuasion in politics and civic life, I often just give people this sounds corny, but this very simple hint, which is look down at your hand. You look at your hand and you got 5 fingers on your hand, and that should remind you about the bones of your kind of typical speech, your typical stump speech, your typical talk, where the thumb and the pinky are sort of the beginning and the end of this thing, where you're going to tell folks what you're trying to do, what your objective is, what you're there for, and you'll come back to that at the end with your pinky. You will make the same point, reinforce what brought you there and what you're trying to do. But in between, you got those 3 other fingers, and it's really helpful just to think about having a speech in 3 parts. Like, I want to talk about 3 things that we got to do here, 3 changes we got to make, 3 reasons why the incumbent needs to be, removed from office, 3 reasons why we got to have a higher minimum wage, whatever it might be, right? This is, of course, the most basic elementary structure. And once you get practice at it, you'll riff and you'll revise and you'll change that. And it might be 2, it might be 4, might be other number of points in between. But it's really handy, literally and figuratively, to kind of have that reminder of just, oh gosh, I've been talking for 10 minutes. I'm still on, on this finger. I got to move on. I got to kind of keep a sense of structure, because the thing is that, speakers will often forget that just because a speech might look decent on paper, the ear takes in things so much differently than the eye does, right? And people's attention span, their ability to remember what you said 3 minutes ago, is way harder when you're just watching someone speak live rather than reading what they might have had to say. So,
and it's a different skill to write for the ear than it is to write for the eye.
It's fundamental, which goes to the third dimension here, which is the music of the speech. Like, how do you do this? How do you construct this speech in a way so that it has both an emotional arc, right? And, you can be going from sad to happy, happy to sad, angry to hopeful, whatever it is. But you got to take people on a journey somehow, kind of emotionally. And that journey should be reflected in the musicality of your speech. Like, you might start out quiet and somber, but by the end you might get really fired up and in a repetitive kind of refrain, that's church-like or something. Or you might start out really, shouty and like you're at a rally or something, but by the end, you're trying to hold people's attention and you're speaking at a whisper and you're just getting people really quiet and focused. There's no magic formula for how to do it, but you just got to be conscious that, the worst thing for the ear, the worst thing for an audience is monotony. If all you do is you're the same tempo, the same emotional caliber, the same emotional, sound quality, the same, just rhythm throughout, then people will tune out, right? You got to know how to bring people up. You got to know how to bring people down. You got to know how to use silence. You got to know how to use loud and soft. And, that's, again, it's literally like singing, right? If someone were just singing at the top of their voice super loud the whole time for 3 minutes straight, they would lose American Idol, right? They even if their voice was super powerful and beautiful, it's the ones who know how to modulate who hold the judge's attention. So all three of those dimensions of strategy, having a clear sense of your objective, structure, understanding the architecture of how you're putting this thing together, and then music, and having a feel for the emotional contours of what you're trying to say. But I think most importantly, what the audience, the people in the room, are feeling or are giving you when you come in.
That's excellent advice and very concrete. I want to ask a follow-up question on the strategy part of it. So when you're talking about coming up with a crisp objective on it, you're saying something more than I'm a candidate and I'm going in front of this group asking for endorsement. I have to give my stump speech. I get 2 minutes to do it. And my objective is to get them to vote for me. You're saying take that to another level that weaves in your message. If I'm reading this right, that it's like,
I'm glad you're pushing on that to unpack that. So having a crisp objective is only step one in the strategy process. From there, you got to make a decision. If my objective is, to get people to see me as a credible challenger, for instance, maybe I'm the challenger, maybe I'm not well known, maybe you got a powerful incumbent. If my objective is to get people to see me as a credible candidate, then you got to think about, well, what's my strategy for doing that? Am I going to use humor and humility? Am I going to, use a bit of moral outrage about the misdeeds of the incumbent? Am I going to be, really about showing that I'm in command and I'm cool and competent because the incumbent is, like some people we might have seen in the White House, off the cuff and a little crazy. You got to decide as a matter of strategy, how am I going to set this contrast? How am I going to define myself? And am I going to use a strategy of straight up low key information, or am I going to do something much more emotional and appeals to emotion? Am I going to use kind of sarcasm and satire, or am I going to use straight up making the case in a more lawyerly way? Right? All these are questions of strategy and choice. Just exactly the way a trial lawyer would have to make decisions of strategy in doing an opening or a closing statement before a jury, right? The objective for that lawyer is, of course, help my client, whether the client is the defendant or the state. But a good trial lawyer knows how to modulate that and have a sense of what strategy the situation calls for, right? If you've got a jury of folks who are kind of wonky and they look like accountants and professionals, then you're not going to come in with something that sounds like, revivalist, rally type rhetoric. And conversely, if you've got a jury of people who it seems to you are really going to respond to, metaphor and biblical story or parable or whatever, then you don't want to go the more analytical route, right? That idea of, but my main point is you can't have a clear sense of strategy unless you are super clear about your objective. Those things have to go together. That's great.
Good. Question about repetition. So, when we're advising campaigns to have, a message and then repeat it over and over and over again, that's the only way that voters are going to, capture your message and assign you to the message. Do you lose a certain amount of authenticity if you're given the same speech that has the same message over and over again? And if so, if that's a threat, how do you prevent that from happening?
I don't think you inherently lose authenticity. I think it's all about whether you are, present in the moment. To me, the most important part of speech writing and speech giving has nothing to do with what's coming out of your mouth. It has everything to do with how you listen and how you read the room. Full body listening. I'm not just talking about kind of, hearing what people are saying, during the chit chat before, but even as you're going, reading their silences, reading how much they're with you or not with you, getting
like
a feel
the energy that you feel from the audience, right?
Exactly. That is super important. And if you're tuned in, if you're really reading that room and tuned in, every single room is different, which means every single time you're giving the same stump speech using the same message is a different performance, right? It's only monotonous and repetitive if you don't care about the audience and if they're just wallpaper and you're just speaking at the wallpaper. Yeah, that gets pretty boring, but don't worry, it won't go on for very long because you're going to lose, right? But if you actually tune in and read the room and get a sense of things, then the adjustments you're making, that it's like, a rock musician or a jazz musician or a stand-up comic. Like it's no two shows are alike, right? Even if the song is the same song, even if the playlist is exactly the same, and the chords, right? The chord chart is always the same, but you're going to riff slightly differently every time because of what the room is giving you.
So what if you have written what you think is a really good joke or a really good applause line, and it worked in one audience, and now you're like, yes, this totally works, and then you deliver it, and it fails? How do you recover from something like that if you're reading the room and trying to figure out how to make adjustments on the fly?
I mean, it's, you recover from that the way that a batter in baseball recovers after getting, after swinging and missing. You make note of why you missed and what the pitcher was doing to you, and what you were expecting and what he threw you. And then you file that away as dispassionately as you can for the next at-bat, right? I mean, it's politics, speaking in public in politics, like baseball, is a game of infinite repeat play, and it's a bummer to swing and miss. It's a bummer to strike out, but, professionals learn from the strikeouts. And I think that's part of what you got to do when you're a candidate or just anybody in any role in public life. You're not going to connect with every audience, and you're not going to read the room right every time. And that's great. It's not even just fine. That's great. Again, as long as your antenna are up, it's all learning.
Do you think people should try and be funny in speeches?
I think people should. This is so trite. I think people should be themselves. I don't think people should be anything other than themselves. Now, if there was a while, you may remember, 20, 25 years ago, when Al Gore, took on a persona that was kind of a double down version of his actual persona, wonky, wooden, dry, and he developed a good public sense of humor, making fun of himself that way, right? That's, And that was kind of endearing for a while until that itself became wooden, wonky, robotic, and repetitive. And then you realize, oh, he's not really in the moment. He's just now, been trained like a dog to kind of do this trick over and over again. I think you got to be authentic. For some people, humor is going to work, and for some people, it's not. For some people, the style of humor that works is going to be, joke telling. For others, it's going to be very subtle, kind of, winking, wry asides and, sardonic, under the breath things. But, the question is, the question for a candidate is, what are you like around people? When you're at a dinner party or when you're talking to your family, are you somebody who likes to make jokes? Are you somebody who, can connect? I think more than ever today, audiences can sniff out when you're just pretending to be something you're not. And again, like one of the ways in which I'll tip my hat to Donald Trump, even though I don't, I don't support him on any level.
It's a tiny hat. It's a tiny hat that you're tipping. Is he, he kind of perversely has made, he is so authentic in his fakeness that, people will give him credit. Like it's this loop, double switched looping kind of thing where, he's kind of a fake, he's made for TV, but he's being so real about it that you kind of like it. He's playing himself, right? And I think Trump himself is actually a very good example of what we were talking about a moment earlier, which is he during the campaign and even to a certain extent as president, he gives the same message over and over again. The same bad guys, the same false promises, the same false choices and what have you. And he doesn't get bored. Like he reads rooms. He gets a certain kind of energy, and it's and again, put aside whether you like that energy, put aside whether it's some of that energy is malevolent or authoritarian. The fact is that there is something to learn from somebody who is who knows himself, even if he knows that he himself is kind of a fake, and he knows how people are responding to him. Yeah,
It's tough to agree with that, but I totally agree with that.
Yeah, I totally agree as well. It's the only kudos that he will ever be given on Election University. His authenticity of being fake. So I want to talk a little bit about body language and presence. And you hinted at it a little bit. And I wonder if we can elaborate a little bit on what we think you should look like when delivering a speech. Hand in pocket. Where should your hands and arms be? How much movement should you have? Should you smile? Which amount of eye contact is good? What's too creepy? What do you...
Do you have a signature move?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the only universal thing I would say is about centering your body and breathing. Like I think so many speakers in politics, number one, forget to breathe. Again, that sounds as stupid as, forget to be awake. But once you're up there, you often will, either because of stress or excitement or whatever, just start unspooling long sentences and everything and kind of in one long breath. And then you have to take this giant gulp of air, and you realize you're not, you're not in command of yourself. And I think the counterpart to that is centering your body. Like before you begin, just take note of, is my weight balanced? Am I standing on my own 2 feet in a way here that is not uncomfortable for myself or uncomfortable to look at, right? And center yourself, take that half moment of a breath, and then go. And I think those are the a couple of the universals. Beyond that, I think again, it becomes questions of style that, I'm super against one-size-fits-all method to the body language of how you speak. There are going to be some speakers for whom it really is the natural, authentic thing to not move around very much and to, and to be, very controlled, and others are going to roam the stage and be very, effusive and all that, and use their arms and gesture and so forth. The thing that I want any speaker to be conscious of, though, is that your body and your voice are instruments. They are instruments, and you are making music and you are performing. So some performers hold people's attention by performing very tiny movements and forcing a listener or a viewer in the audience to focus in and pay super close attention. Other performers get your attention by wild gesticulation, right? I'm not sure that one is, there's no one size fits all. One isn't right or wrong. It depends on you and on the situation. But the knowledge that you are in control of this, I use the word command. You have to have command of yourself. Command presence is a term that they use in the military. Marine Corps Officer Candidate School teaches you, like, the elements of command presence are about body, about bearing and, steadiness of your gaze and, the strength of your voice and so forth. And that is command presence if you're a Marine Corps officer trying to establish that there's a reason why a platoon of 35, kids between 18 and 20, plus their, sergeant who has many more years experience than you do, why all of them should listen to you, right? Your body is an instrument and your voice is an instrument in that setting. But what works for the Marine Corps is going to be very different from what works at a precinct meeting, or what works at a Democratic Party rally, or what works in a small living room of a group of prospective donors, right? So there's no one size fits all, except breathe, center your body, and be conscious of how, again, you're modulating and using your instrument of both body and voice. The meta message you want people to take away from the encounter with you is that you are in command of yourself, and that they ought to give you the benefit of the doubt to follow you, right? That you are worthy of command, not only of yourself, but of the situation.
That is some really great advice that I think totally
perfect.
applies to like life and social situations in general, and just how you carry yourself around the world.
There's one little note I would add, actually. I think, we're talking at a time where there's a record number of women running for office in exactly the down ballot races that you two are focusing on in this podcast, and a record number of people of color as well doing the same. And so I think, oftentimes for women, there's pressure to, quote, act like a man when you speak. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes for people of color, there's pressure to, quote, act white when you speak. And I think, again, I would bust through both of those sets of expectations. There's already, if you think about, even in the last half decade, the way in which the kind of infamous Hillary pantsuit, it has become part of a sartorial uniform. And I mean uniform, like women candidates feel like they got to dress a certain way, wear a certain kind of jacket with pantsuit, that gets cliche. And even though it's only a few years old, audiences and groups of citizens are already bored with this kind of sense of, oh, here's a standard issue woman candidate who's not trying to be a man, but she's trying to be what an approved woman candidate is like, right? You just got to be you. And that does require pushing back, for a female candidate more than a male candidate. It requires an initial step of actually naming and then pushing aside male expectations and male-centered conventions about what it means to present oneself in public. But once you push those aside, don't fall into the trap of thinking, therefore, that now there's an approved female way of being, and only one way of being a woman in public. You have to, again, focus in on that authenticity and that centeredness, that earns the respect that derives from command presence. Command presence is not, outside of, even in the Marine Corps, frankly, command presence is not just about barking and yelling and flexing your muscles, right? Some of the most effective Marine Corps officers are people who are quiet and intense and really close listeners and readers of people. And when they may not say much, but when they say it, people step to, right?
Right.
And so, again, I want to be conscious of the way in which gender and racial stereotypes can get in the way of you tapping into your command of your instrument.
That's awesome. We've talked a lot about, being authentic, being yourself. And one of our most popular podcasts so far is one that we did talking about how to be an introvert in politics and how to have better conversations. And with that being one of our most popular podcasts, it leads me to believe that there might be a lot of people who want to write a stump speech, but maybe have stage fright or don't know how to be the commanding presence. Do you have advice on how to practice and get over some of those fears of public speaking?
Yeah, I mean, number one, I would remind anybody that it's not just introverts who have a fear of public speaking. I mean, it is a widespread fear, even among people who in other social situations would call themselves extroverts. So, number one, don't be too hard on yourself if you are more introverted. Number two, I think, there's a great book, and you may have talked about this on the other episode of the podcast, by a woman named Susan Cain, Cain, called Quiet, about the kind of hidden power of introverts. And her general message, which has influenced me, is that introverts shouldn't think that they have to try to be kind of junior grade extroverts. It is wholly possible for an introvert to establish command presence just by being herself or himself. And that may mean training yourself initially to get past that first hump of looking people in the eye and, staying connected with them in a social situation. But once you're past that first hump, the way you do this, again, it goes back to everything we were saying about speech giving and speech writing, is remembering it's not about you. Even when you're the candidate, it's not about you, right? Sometimes introversion and shyness are a kind of a funny, distorted kind of egoism and self-centeredness. Everybody's looking at me. Everybody thinks I'm this or that, and you have this kind of fear. And what you have to remind yourself is it's not about you. Like, you are there to listen to other people. You are there to serve other people. You are there to kind of read the fears and the hopes and the needs of other people. And so if you're a little bit shy or awkward, fine. Like, tune in even harder, listen even harder. Tell folks that you sincerely want to hear them and let them do more of the talking initially, right? And out of what they give you, construct your stump speech. Make your stump speech about, let me tell you 3 things that I've heard from people as I've been listening. And tell people, I'm not a big social extrovert guy. I love to listen. And you know what? I think our politics could use more of that kind of listening. Being an introvert doesn't mean that you're not a good problem solver. In many ways, it helps you get past a lot of the egoism that gets in the way of political problem solving. So I think there's a lot of strengths that introverts bring to the table that you can both bring to bear and apply, but also remind yourself of while remembering that it's not about you, right? And that'll help you get past that fear that everyone thinks you suck or everyone thinks you're this or that, and help you just push on through to the job at hand, which is to, get yourself in position to serve the people.
Thinking a little bit more about the content of a speech that folks want to write, as they're thinking about the 3 prongs that you laid out, and really more the strategy objective part of this. Do you think it's important for folks to try to connect on a personal level, talk more about who they are as people in their speech versus, say, their experience or their relevance to the position that they're seeking? Do you think one outweighs the other, or do you have to try to accomplish both in the speech?
I do think it's important to tell a story of I do think it's important to tell your story. And I think it's important, actually, the great community organizer Marshall Gans, who's a teacher of community organizing, and you two may have encountered him because he had a lot to do with training armies of young people to organize for candidate Obama back in 2007 and 8. Marshall Gans talks about these 3 stories that are kind of nested stories that are key to community organizing, and I would say they are also key to effective stump speech writing and stump speech giving. and that is a story of self, a story of us, and a story of now, right? You got to run a thread through those three stories, and you can do it even if it's a 2-minute stump speech. A story of self. I'm Eric Liu. I'm the son of immigrants. My parents came from China. I grew up my whole life not taking for granted anything that I've got, and believing that every great thing I've gotten to do in this country comes with an obligation to be useful to my country. Then a story of us. Right now, our country, is polarized, divided, unsure of itself, and losing its sense that, and kind of, beset by this idea that maybe our best days are behind us. And we're all fearing and feeling that, whether we're on the right or the left, right? And that brings you to the story of now, which is, that's why I think right now this is a critical moment for us as Americans to regain our confidence and to remember that the way to believe in American greatness is not to push out immigrants, is not to disfavor people of color, is not to make LGBTQ people feel like second-class citizens. The way to true greatness and the way to really make America great again is to double down on what got us here in the first place, right? And that's what we got to do right now. So right there, in about a minute, I've just stitched together a story of self, a story of us, and a story of now, right? And you've got to do that, and the story, in a way that then, helps people that you're speaking to feel like they can identify with you, yes, but more importantly, that they feel like we're all part of a larger story, right? Mm-hmm. Not everybody in the room is going to be second-generation child of immigrants, but everybody can relate to the story of us right now, that we're living in a country that can't even define American and is unsure about whether our best days are behind us. And everybody can relate to the urgency of now, right? And so that way of thinking about story, again, strategically, is more important than just mechanically starting every speech saying, I was born in a log cabin, blah, 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 blah. Here's my resume.
Right. Yeah, the weaving of the resume is always difficult because I find candidates, one, if you put too much resume in there, they feel like they're bragging. And there are a certain number of candidates who don't necessarily, that's not authentic for them or doesn't feel good to them to be rattling off education and the experience that they have or the other elected office that they had prior to the one that they're seeking or whatever it is. But I also think it's important to talk about the relevance of why this person is running for this seat or why this candidate is best suited for this position too. And so there's always that sort of delicate balance of like sacrificing resume for more story and just what the right balance is.
Again, it isn't that hard to balance if you have a clear objective and a clear sense of your strategy.
Right.
Your resume, the referencing of your resume is not the point of a speech. It should only be happening in service of your strategy, right? And so if I'm a candidate who didn't serve in the military and I'm speaking to a group of veterans, then maybe there's a part of your resume that shows your bona fides in terms of your family history with the military or something that you've done, in veteran serving organizations or something that, where you can show that you know something, even if you yourself didn't serve, right? Depending on the context, if you're aware of what you're trying to achieve with a given room, there will be parts of your, I don't even want to use resume, there will be parts of your life experience that are relevant and that you ought to bring to bear in the conversation, right? It's, again, I wouldn't overthink this as a candidate. This is just how you would talk in making a friend, right? You'd want to make the other person feel like there's something in your life experience that can connect with something in their life experience. Yeah,
that's great. Other than the content of the speech and the way that people are delivering it, how they look when they're delivering it, are there other elements that folks should be considering when giving a speech, maybe the lighting or the podium versus a microphone? What other elements should folks be conscious of and prepare for as they're giving speeches?
Well, to the extent that it's always important if you're going to be giving a stump speech somewhere, if possible, to check out the scene beforehand so you understand what the room looks like. You understand if there's a great distance put between you, and the audience. Understand if there's a big podium or lectern between you, or if the vibe or the environment is one that's just people are ditching the lectern and just talking and roaming the stage. It's good to have even a moment's prep for that, so that you're not totally winging it when you walk into that arena. Number two, know your instrument, right? I'm 5'4", and so there are a lot of lecterns and podiums that are just too big for me, right? That will block me out. And so I've gotten really good at kind of getting a sense of that. And if I sense that, that lectern is going to be a barrier between me and the audience, I ditch it and I just go to the center of the stage without any lectern, and I'm just making eye contact, and there's nothing between me and the people in the room, right?
Right.
Now, when you do that, you lose the security blanket of having a podium or a lectern where your notes might be and what have you. But that's, again, you internalize the five fingers of your hand, and you remember your main points and remember the main chords that you want to hit, and then you can do it, right? But the other thing I would say, if you are behind a podium, is don't grip that podium like you're holding on for dear life. That happens so often, right? And so unconsciously, be at ease there. And, you can put your hands on the podium if you want to, but you got to release them. You got to move them. If you're in conversation at a coffee shop with somebody, your hands would not be gripping the table at Starbucks, right? Your hands would be moving. You'd be, tapping the table to emphasize a point, or you'd be, raising your hand to raise a question, whatever it might be. It's just the same way, right? And I think being conscious of that helps, because sometimes people just by default, maybe because they're scared or because it seems like unconsciously their body language is saying, I need protection here. They'll just hold on to that podium for dear life.
Been there.
Yeah, we've all been there.
We've all been there.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Citizen University. You were just in New Orleans and Atlanta recently. Do you have a fun little anecdote of something that happened down there? We'd love to hear more about the work that Citizen University is doing.
You bet. Our whole team was just down in New Orleans. We just held our first what's called a Citizen Fest, which is a festive learning summit about civic power and building power in civic life. It's an offshoot of our larger work at Citizen University, which is a nonprofit that's, we're based in Seattle, but we do work all around the United States, and all of our work is about trying to foster a culture of more powerful citizenship, teaching the skills of it, teaching the values of it, teaching the kind of the elements of what it means to show up in civic life and create community and build power from the bottom up. And so in New Orleans, we were partnering with a great organization that has a chapter there called the Family Independence Initiative, which empowers and organizes poor people, low-income families in cities around the United States to create circles of mutual aid to help each other economically and to build some clout politically. That's what FII does. And so they were our partners on the ground. We had this amazing convening where we had folks from literally all walks of life in New Orleans, and workshops on activating art for political power, workshops on building conversations about civic character and values in ways that don't sound like moralizing or don't sound like eat your vegetables, but make people feel like make people feel like, this is a time for decency and a time for owning. Remembering that society becomes how you behave, and that we have a lot of bad behavior trickling down from the presidency, and it requires a lot of of countercultural civic behavior from the bottom up, even in some of the hardest hit communities in the country. And so, but by far one of the highlights in New Orleans, we had, because it was in New Orleans, we had amazing food, we had amazing music, and throughout this mini conference. And one of the things that we did was, on stage, but then the people on stage had all of us doing this together as a form of collective action. We were led by a group called the Who Dat Steppers, doing great New Orleans style step dancing, and it was fantastic. Mainly because it was so hard to learn. So not everybody knew what the heck they were doing, but everybody participated. And that was about as good a metaphor for what we got to do for democracy, which is to, get people off the sidelines, get them, onto the field, onto the floor, get them moving, even if they're not entirely sure what steps they're supposed to take, and get them feeling like it's not a burdensome duty, but rather a party to join and a thing that they don't want to miss out on. That was the spirit of what we were doing in New Orleans. And at Citizen University, we're always trying to do work like that. That's bottom-up power building, but has a spirit of joy to it.
God, that's fantastic. I wish I would have gone.
That's super cool.
What's next? What's next on the calendar?
We're doing events all around the country. If folks want to just go to our website, which is citizenuniversity.us, you'll see events small and large that we're doing, not just on the coast, up and down the heartland and throughout the South, and just trying to reach different people with the same kind of message and spirit.
That's fantastic. That's citizenuniversity.us. We'll include everything in the show notes as well. Eric, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, it's been so great, and I really appreciate that you do this podcast and that you're practicing what I preach. You are empowering countless numbers of people out there who want to get engaged, who want to step off the sidelines, and I salute you both. I tip my real big hat.
Real big hat.
not the little one that I use for Trump.
I don't want a tiny Trump hat tipping.
No.
I want a
Only the largest of hats.
I want an Obama-sized big hat, not a tiny Trump hat.
Thank you, Eric.
Eric, this was
All
awesome.
Right, thanks, guys.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
A huge thank you to Eric Liu of Citizen University.
Eric Liu.
Always
the inspiration.
Did not disappoint.
That guy. No, never.
Yet again, another grand slam by Eric Liu.
I learned so much.
It's so good. And I think not only did we provide some very concrete examples and some advice for candidates who are interested in, crafting their own stump speech and having struggle with what to put pen to paper. We also just had some really great examples of content that you could do. It was fantastic. I was thrilled with the interview. I don't think I'll ever forget the 5 fingers thing, the start and end with the same point and then have 3 points in between. For the listeners who can't see us, both Jason and I were counting on our fingers, doing. I would be the person on stage with my hand out doing the 1, 2, 3 points and looking ridiculous while I do it. But that would be my gesture. Probably. I mean, I don't know that he was saying display it for everyone. No, but I would. That's what I'm saying, is that I'm the weirdo who would do that without thinking about it. Sure. Why not? No judgment at all. You be your authentic self, Rainey. Thanks. None of us are going to judge you for it. Listeners, what did you think? We'd love to hear your feedback on this particular episode and what you thought. Are you having any troubles out there on the campaign trail that we can help you with? We will definitely connect up with experts in that particular issue area and deliver them to you. You can always reach us at podcast@electionu.com. And leave us comments and reviews and stars and all the things on the iTunes and the Spotify and all the other places where you can find our podcast. We love it. Listeners, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Election University Podcast. I'm Jason Bennett. And I'm Rainey Cohen. Thanks again, and we'll catch you next week. Bye. Thank you for listening. This week's episode has ended, but the campaign fun doesn't have to. Head on over to www.electionu.com, where you can access all of the links mentioned in today's episode, as well as the show notes. There you can also sign up for regular announcements or register for our campaign school. It's your very own online personal trainer for winning campaigns. www.electionu.com. Click, learn, win.